You have stood behind someone in a grocery store line. They are wearing a fleece pullover that has a small snag near the left cuff. They are buying store-brand pasta, a rotisserie chicken, and a bottle of mid-range olive oil. They pay with a debit card. The transaction takes 11 seconds. They leave. You think nothing of it. That person has $4.7 million in a taxable brokerage account and owns 3 commercial properties outright in 2 different states. You will never know this. That is the point. The silent millionaire is not a personality type. It is not a costume. It is not someone who drives a beige sedan as a performance of humility or who refuses to buy nice things as a form of identity. It is a set of behaviors and systems that accumulate quietly over a long period of time and produce an outcome that is almost completely invisible to the outside world. The wealth exists. The signals do not. Those 2 things are not in conflict. They are by design. Here is how it is usually built. Not in a single moment. Not through a liquidity event that arrives like a storm. Usually through something boring. A plumbing company founded in 1987 that now employs 19 people and clears $800,000 a year in net profit. A dentist who opened a second practice at 44 and sold both at 61. A software engineer who made $130,000 a year for 22 years and invested 38% of it every single year without interruption. An accountant who bought a small apartment building in 2003 and never sold it. The mechanism is not exciting, the outcome is. The people who built it tend not to describe it as exciting either. They use words like consistent and patient and boring and fine. Those are not false modesty. Those are accurate descriptions of the process. Lifestyle inflation is the place where most wealth quietly exits the system. Income goes up, spending follows it upward at nearly the same rate. The house gets bigger. The car gets newer. The vacations get longer. Each upgrade feels earned because it is earned. The problem is not the upgrade. The problem is when the upgrade becomes permanent overhead that has to be serviced forever. The silent millionaire tends to lag their consumption behind their income by a significant margin for a long time. Not forever, but long enough. Long enough for the compounding to develop mass. Long enough for the portfolio to grow large enough that it begins doing meaningful work on its own without requiring constant intervention. That lag is not deprivation, it is arithmetic. The privacy piece is deliberate and it starts early. The names are not on social media. The business interests are held in LLCs with registered agents and addresses that do not trace back to a personal residence. The car is registered to the holding company. The home is in a trust. None of this is secretive in a dramatic sense. It is administrative. It is the same discipline that keeps the investments automated and the lifestyle modest. Anonymity is not paranoia. It is a rational response to the fact that visible wealth attracts friction. Solicitations, lawsuits, people with business propositions that arrive unannounced. Separating identity from assets is not evasion. It is insulation. The people who have done this well tend to maintain a very small online footprint that reflects none of the actual financial picture. What you see, if you see anything at all, is a name in a city and maybe a LinkedIn profile that reads like everyone else's. What changes as the wealth grows is not the person. It is the options available to the person. At $1 million, you can weather a job loss without panic. At $5 million, you can decline a bad business deal without needing to calculate whether you can afford to. At $20 million, your time becomes a more carefully protected resource than your money because your money is now effectively working full-time without you. Optionality is the real product of this kind of accumulation. Not objects, not status. The ability to say no. The ability to wait. The ability to choose the terms. Every tier of wealth that gets covered in this video adds more of that and less urgency to everything else. What does not change is the discipline. The people at $10 million maintain the same basic structure that they had at $2 million. Automated investments. Deliberate attention to where time goes. Routines that are protected from disruption. Discretion that is habitual rather than effortful. Attention is treated as a finite resource that compounds just like capital. The people who dissipate their attention on performance, on social comparison, on signaling their position, tend not to hold their position for long. The people who protect their attention tend to keep building quietly without anyone noticing they are building at all. Here is how to watch the rest of this. Each tier covered from $1 million to $650 million is not just a bigger version of the tier below it. The composition changes, the liquidity changes, the risk architecture changes, the leverage changes. At $1 million, most of the wealth is in fairly standard vehicles. Index funds, home equity, retirement accounts. At $50 million, you are in a different conversation entirely. Operating businesses, private equity, real estate portfolios with professional management, family office infrastructure. At $200 million, the number of decisions you are personally making about money has actually decreased because the systems have grown sophisticated enough to run largely without your hourly attention. Think in those terms as each tier unfolds, not just how much. How it is held, how liquid it is, how much leverage it carries, how much risk is concentrated versus distributed. A person with $8 million in a single private business and a person with $8 million in a diversified public portfolio are both $8 million net worth individuals. They are not in the same position, not even close. The person in the fleece pullover at the grocery store understood this a long time ago. They are not performing anything. They already know what the number is. They are just buying pasta. The first thing to understand about this tier is that most of it is not cash. The $4.7 million figure does not mean $4.7 million sitting in a checking account waiting to be deployed. It means home equity, retirement accounts with withdrawal restrictions, a taxable brokerage that would take 2 weeks to fully liquidate, and maybe an ownership stake in a business that has never been formally valued and could not be sold on a Tuesday afternoon. The net worth is real. The liquidity is not what the number implies. Most people in this tier cannot access the majority of their wealth without triggering taxes, penalties, waiting periods, or consequences that make the access expensive in a way that changes the math entirely. Understanding that distinction is the entire difference between knowing someone's net worth and knowing their actual position. The typical path here does not involve a single event. The software engineer who made $140,000 for 18 years and never touched the automated transfers. The physical therapist who opened a second location, ran both lean and sold at 58. The electrician who invested the surplus from every good year and never adjusted the lifestyle in proportion to the income. The mechanisms are ordinary. The results are not ordinary only because the mechanisms were maintained without interruption. Most people who started the same process did not maintain it. They upgraded the car when the income rose. They took on more house than the budget could carry without stress. They stopped investing during the years that felt uncertain, which are most years if you are paying attention. The ones who stayed in the system arrived here. The ones who exited and re-entered at intervals arrived somewhere else. The spending pattern in this tier has a specific texture to it. The car is reliable and paid for. Not a statement car. Not a car from 2009 kept running on stubbornness. A solid, well-maintained vehicle that is no longer being financed. The vacations happen and they are good vacations, taken in full, without financial anxiety in the background. The kitchen gets renovated eventually. The renovation is real and it is high quality. It is not rushed and it is not done to impress anyone who does not use that kitchen. The distinction is between spending on quality of experience and spending on visibility of status. One of those produces satisfaction, the other produces a recurring obligation to maintain the signal. This tier abandoned the second category a long time ago, usually quietly and without announcing it. The financial architecture underneath this is not complicated. An emergency reserve held in a high-yield account, typically 6 to 12 months of actual expenses, not of income. Tax-advantaged accounts maxed on autopilot, 401k at the employer maximum. Roth contributions where income allows or backdoor conversions where it does not. A taxable brokerage receiving whatever's left after the tax advantage buckets are full. The investments inside all three accounts are broadly the same. Total market index funds, international exposure, a bond allocation that shifts gradually as the timeline shortens. No individual stock bets, no sector concentration. No crypto position large enough to matter in either direction. The automation is the point. It runs without requiring a decision every month, which means it runs during the months when making a decision would have been the wrong move. Risk management in this tier is taken seriously in a way that is invisible to outsiders. The disability insurance policy is in place and has been reviewed recently. The umbrella policy exists and is sized to the actual exposure. The business owner has a buy-sell agreement documented and funded. The income-producing ability is insured because the income-producing ability is the machine that built everything and continues to build it. Losing the machine without a plan is not a recoverable event at this tier in the way that a market correction is recoverable. A market correction requires patience. Losing the primary income source without coverage requires selling things you did not plan to sell. The social pressure in this tier is real, and it comes from people who are close enough to sense that the resources exist. The family member with a business idea, the friend with an investment opportunity that requires a decision by Friday. The colleague who mentions the vacation they cannot quite afford and waits. The people who have built into this tier have developed a language for these moments that is consistent and non-negotiable and delivered without cruelty. The money is not available. The money is fully committed. The answer is no, and it arrives quickly and without extensive explanation because extensive explanation invites negotiation, and negotiation is a door that does not close cleanly once it is opened. The boundary is not unkind, it is structural. The mistakes that arrest people at the edge of this tier and hold them there are specific. Lifestyle creep that arrives gradually and looks like reasonable reward at every individual step until the monthly overhead requires an income that allows no disruption. Tax planning that happens at filing time instead of throughout the year, which costs tens of thousands annually that could have stayed in the portfolio. Overconfidence following a run of good outcomes, which produces concentrated bets in single assets, single businesses, single market narratives that carry risks the diversified portfolio never carried. And the belief that the work is mostly done once a certain number appears on the statement, which produces the kind of inattention that allows slow leaks to go unnoticed for years. The people who move through this tier and out the other side do not do anything dramatic. They maintain the system. They review the insurance. They ignore the tips. They pay the fee-only planner annually. They keep the lifestyle lagging behind the income. They let the compounding continue undisturbed. The number grows. Nobody notices. That is the design. At some point the architecture changes. Not because of a decision you announce, but because of a problem that appears one Tuesday when you sit down with your CPA and the numbers are large enough that the standard tools no longer fit the situation. The spreadsheet still opens the same way. The logic inside it is different now. The first shift is from saver to allocator. For a decade or more, the question was how much to set aside and where to put it. That question does not disappear, but it becomes secondary to a different question, which is where does capital go from here to produce the most durable result? Public markets are still present. The index funds are still running. But the position is large enough now that meaningful diversification requires moving beyond them, not out of dissatisfaction with the index, but because the index is a single category of asset, and a single category of asset is a single category of risk, regardless of how many companies it contains. The diversification that happens in this tier goes into territory most people never access. Real estate at the direct ownership level, not REITs on a brokerage platform, but actual properties with actual tenants and actual property managers who send actual reports. Private equity, which means owning a portion of a business that does not trade on any exchange, which means the value is illiquid and estimated and occasionally surprising in both directions. Venture capital at the early stage, a small allocation, size with the understanding that most of it will return nothing and one position might return everything, and the point is the asymmetry, not the average. And occasionally, a niche operating business, a car wash, a small manufacturing company, a franchise with clean books and a manager already in place. The common thread is that these assets do not move in lockstep with the public market. When the index drops 22% in a quarter, the car wash is still washing cars. None of this is managed alone. The team assembled in this tier is not a luxury. It is the infrastructure, a CPA who plans throughout the year rather than filing at the end of it. An attorney with specific experience in business structures, trusts, and estate documents. A fiduciary financial advisor whose compensation is not connected to what they recommend. The distinction on that last point matters more than it sounds. An advisor paid by commission has a product to sell. An advisor paid by fee has a client to serve. Those are not the same relationship, and at this tier the difference between them is not marginal. It is the difference between a portfolio designed for your outcome and a portfolio designed for someone else's revenue. The tax strategy in this tier is a full-year exercise. Entity structure matters because the same income flowing through different legal structures produces different tax outcomes. Trusts are used not to obscure wealth, but to direct it across time, to children, to causes, to heirs who will inherit it before they have the tools to manage it responsibly. Exit planning begins years before any exit because the tax treatment of a business sale depends on decisions made long before the sale happens. Charitable vehicles are evaluated not purely for generosity, but because they can accomplish genuine good while preserving capital that would otherwise go to taxes. None of this is exotic. All of it requires professionals who are working on your situation specifically, not on a template. The security and privacy adjustments at this tier are quiet and practical. Public exposure is reduced where it can be reduced without inconvenience. Properties held in LLCs rather than personal names. Minimal online footprint around financial matters. Basic home security measures reviewed and updated, not because the threat is dramatic, but because inattention to it would be careless. The people in this tier are not famous. That is partially by design. Fame produces a surface area for problems that anonymity does not. Time becomes the most constrained resource, not money. Time. The question every successful allocator in this tier eventually asks is what can only I do, and what am I doing that someone else could do equally well for a fraction of what my time costs? Assistants handle logistics. Systems handle recurring decisions. The answer no becomes a financial instrument because every hour spent on something low value is an hour not spent on something that compounds. The people who stay in this tier and move through it understand that saying yes to the wrong things is how wealth stalls. The no is not rudeness, it is resource management. Relationships in this tier function differently than they did at lower levels. Deal flow, meaning the access to good investments before they are widely available, does not come from websites or newsletters. It comes from people who know you and trust you and have seen how you operate over time. The attorney who worked on your last transaction mentions an opportunity to a developer who mentions it to you over dinner. The private equity partner you backed 3 years ago calls before anything is formally marketed. These conversations happen quietly, and they happen to people with reputations built over decades of behaving well in rooms where they could have behaved otherwise. The network is not cultivated through networking. It is built through integrity compounded over years, which means it cannot be manufactured quickly by anyone who decides to want it. The people who arrive here and hold here are not especially loud about it. They do not move differently, they do not speak differently. The car is still reasonable. The restaurant is usually the one with good food and no reservation required 6 weeks in advance. The capital is working in 5 categories simultaneously. The team is running the parts that require specialization. The tax strategy is already in place for next year. And the number keeps moving, without ceremony, in the background of a life that looks from the outside like almost anyone else's. At a certain point, the number crosses a threshold where the infrastructure required to maintain it becomes more complex than the strategies that built it. The shift from the prior tier to this one is not announced. It is recognized usually by the attorney first, then the CPA, then you. The meeting where it happens is unremarkable. Someone says the word family office and you do not flinch because you already knew the conversation was coming. A family office is not a building, it is a function. At its most basic, it is the centralized management of a single family's financial affairs at a scale where that management justifies dedicated staff. At $100 million, the question is whether a multi-family office, meaning a shared platform that serves several families, is sufficient. At $200 million, the math on a dedicated single-family operation begins to close. At $400 million, there is no longer a meaningful argument against it. What gets outsourced and what gets kept internal depends on complexity. Investment management, tax compliance, legal work, insurance oversight, estate administration, bill payment, travel coordination, sometimes school selection, and household staff payroll. The point is not control. The point is that at this scale, the consequence of a single administrative failure is large enough to justify systems designed specifically to prevent it. The investment strategy here is not fundamentally different from the prior tier. It is the prior tier taken further out on the risk and illiquidity curve. Concentrated positions exist, sometimes in a single company that represents the origin of all of this, a business built and sold or still operating and still growing. The risk of that concentration is understood. The management of it is deliberate. Diversification happens around the core, not in opposition to it. Private credit, infrastructure, timberland, agricultural land. These are not exotic choices at this tier. They are categories with long return histories, low correlation to public markets, and carrying capacities that scale with the size of the position. The governance question becomes real. A family with $300 million in assets spread across multiple structures, multiple entities, and multiple generations needs documented decision-making processes. Investment policy statements, written criteria for what gets approved and what does not. Trustees with defined mandates. An advisory board in some cases, not for show but because the complexity genuinely benefits from outside perspective. What gets reduced in this tier is single point of failure risk. One person who knows everything and is the only one who knows it is a vulnerability, not an asset. The documentation exists so that if anything changes, the machine continues to run. Asset protection at this level is architectural. Trusts established years earlier are now functioning as designed. New trusts are structured for the generation that has not yet arrived at the table. The legal separation between personal assets and operating assets is maintained rigorously, not because litigation is expected, but because the cost of that separation is low and the cost of not having it is potentially total. Properties are titled correctly, entities are reviewed annually. The attorney is not called when something goes wrong. The attorney is on retainer and participates in planning before anything goes wrong. Philanthropy at this tier is quiet and consequential. Donor-advised funds have been present since the prior tier. Private foundations become viable and sometimes preferable. The foundation can employ staff, direct grants with specificity, and engage in cause-related work in ways a donor-advised fund cannot. What the people in this tier typically do not do is name things after themselves. The hospital wing, the university building, The endowed chair with the brass plaque. Some do, many do not. The ones who do not are harder to find, and their giving is, in some ways, more durable because it is selected for impact rather than recognition. A $4 million grant to a water infrastructure project in a region no one is paying attention to does not generate a press release. It changes the thing it was intended to change. That is the entire point. Privacy at this level is operational, not paranoid. The address on public records is the LLC or the trust or the registered agent, not the residence. Travel happens without a published itinerary. Digital footprint around financial matters is minimal by design, not by accident. Security reviews for the primary residence and any secondary properties are conducted periodically by professionals. Personal device hygiene is taken seriously. The household staff signs appropriate agreements. None of this is dramatic. All of it is routine to anyone operating at this level who has been advised correctly. What luxury looks like here is not what it looks like in the photographs. The private flight is not a status signal. It is 3 hours of uninterrupted work or rest that a commercial flight cannot provide at the schedule required. The health infrastructure, the annual comprehensive physical, the functional medicine consultant, the personal trainer who works around a schedule that does not allow for a gym class at 6:30 on Tuesdays is not indulgence. It is maintenance of the one asset that cannot be replaced and cannot be delegated. The home environment is calibrated not for impressiveness but for function. Quiet, clean air, good light, a kitchen that works, a bed that produces actual sleep. Convenience is purchased not to display wealth but to recover time, and time at this tier has a cost that is fully understood. The number in this tier is large enough that the question of how to get rich has been replaced by the question of how to keep it coherent across time, across generations, and across the inevitable periods when markets do what markets do and the plan is tested against its own assumptions. Pick one thing from this tier that applies to your current level and build toward it this week. Not the family office, not the foundation, the one structural habit, the policy statement, the attorney conversation, the documented decision criteria that belongs one tier above where you are right now. That is always where the work starts. Subscribe for the next breakdown. The number keeps moving.